Welcome to the land of excess, where each plane costs at least $100 million, where each contract runs into the billions of dollars.
It's a very unique business model, perhaps unique in the entire world.
Where time suspends its flight, for it takes at least 10 years and $10 billion to launch a new airplane.
You need to be tenacious. It's like a marathon.
Where, to capture a market, there are no holds barred.
I wouldn't call our competition a fair competition. I would call it a pretty tough competition.
This has never been the land of the Care Bears, neither before, nor during, nor after.
This is a world where even heads of state willingly play salesmen in order to fill the order books. From the conquest of the skies to the conquest of the world, Boeing, Airbus, the account of two continents that have been facing off for close to half a century and who now share a fantastic market worth $150 billion. This is a voyage to the heart of a duel with its many twists and turns. (1969). On the west coast of the United States, the world discovers the largest civilian airplane ever built, the Boeing 747. It can carry up to 600 passengers. For close to 50 years, it would be the Seattle Giants' top money earner and make it the uncontested leader in the field. Since the end of the Second World War, the skies belong to America. Three companies dominate the air transport market: McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed, and the number one, Boeing. At the time, its bestseller, the 707, is the only plane capable of crossing the Atlantic non-stop. Globalization is on the march. Boeing is America, the world's number one passenger plane, the flying fortress of World War II, the B-52s, and their tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam. Air Force One, the official plane of the United States presidents, then is now a Boeing. Even General de Gaulle has no other option. To cross the Atlantic, he has to travel on board a Boeing 707, christened, to save face, Chateau de Versailles. But the world is changing. Already 400 million travelers are flying. Europe has steel and coal, but is on the lookout for a comprehensive industrial project.
There was also the question of whether Europe would be able to simply survive in the air transport revolution, which took off in the early 1960s with the introduction of long and very long-range jet transports.
The European industrialists, who'd previously undertaken some small-scale national projects, had the choice of either becoming subcontractors of the United States, of American industry, or joining forces on their own projects that would answer the needs of the market.
To stand up to the American domination, the European Union presents a united front. France and Germany become partners for an unlikely project: pool all their know-how to design a plane capable of competing with the Americans. Its codename, Airbus.
It wasn't an example of building. It was an example of defensiveness, basically defending what they had. All of the companies involved in Airbus had jetliner programs, and all of them were being destroyed gradually by the U.S. might.
To meet the challenge, everyone pitches in. Each state involved has to make their specific contribution to this daring erector set. There's something for everyone. England will supply the wings, Holland the tail, Germany the fuselage, and the final assembly is to take place in Toulouse, France. Why do simple when you can do complicated? Meanwhile, Boeing on the other side of the Atlantic is laughing up its sleeve.
In the early days of Airbus, Boeing's attitude was, I would say, arrogant. It was like, oh, those Europeans, the French, the English, the Germans, make a plane together? Technically, it won't work. They'll turn out a camel. Some measure in inches, some in centimeters. They just happen to forget that we'd managed to create Concorde with the English.
The Airbus engineers decide to tackle Boeing on the mid-range aircraft market. The new European plane is christened the A300. Unlike its Boeing counterpart, it can carry 300 passengers with 2 jet engines, whereas its competitor needed 3 or 4 engines.
When they first rolled out the Airbus, before its maiden flight, I was at the controls and we were taxiing with Concorde in front of the authorities, the statesmen. The whole world was there, plus everyone from Aerospatiale. So we paraded with Concorde, and it was the eve of our inaugural flight. Concorde was already up and flying. And at the end of this dog and pony show, when we were putting on the parking brakes, we saw the whole crowd flocking to the Concorde. Well, I tell you, we were pretty disappointed. And when I went out onto the stairs, the plant manager, Bernard Dufour, a friend of mine, comes over and says to me, Bernard, what are we going to do with this big fat cow of yours?
Now the task was to transform this fat cow into a cash cow for the 4 European countries that financed this venture on spec. The challenge was even more difficult to meet, given that the competition was racking up one success after another. The Boeing 747 had been in service for 2 years, and all the airlines, even the Europeans, were captivated by it. Air France was even among the first to acquire Boeing's jumbo jet. At the beginning of the 1970s, Airbus was the least of Boeing's worries, as they had their hands full on the American front.
So basically, they looked at the tri-jet battle between Douglas and Lockheed, and they said, well, we're not going to get in the middle of that. Those two will fight each other. Maybe one will lose and be out of the market, and that's great. That A300, you know, maybe it'll work, maybe it isn't, maybe it won't. If it does work, we'll do it better.
Personally, I believe that there was a lot good happening in the A300. Collectively, Boeing probably did not give Airbus enough credit.
After the A300 had completed its shakedown flights and got its certification, we were left with nothing to do. I decided, with of course the green light from Béthey, to go out and play salesman. So we traveled all over the world. We took the plane to South America, to the São Paulo Air Show. We were very active. We met with the airline companies. And curiously enough, because we were engineers and pilots, the airlines believed us more than a sales rep who was there to peddle his wares. We weren't peddling our wares. We were saying that our plane was the best, period. And we explained why.
The American continent was Boeing's exclusive preserve. Airbus decided to take a roundabout way in. For their first commercial campaigns, they threw their efforts into India and Asia. This strategy would pay off when these countries emerged. Orders remained discouragingly scarce. Even the European carriers hesitated to take the plunge. By 1974, Airbus had sold only 4 planes. The ambitious European project was not taking off.
You have to admit that European aviation had a very poor reputation, very poor, because there was no after-sales service. We didn't know what it was. And in all the financial calculations that we did on the amortization of the airplane, we never took into account 1 cent of after-sales service. The maintenance and such was paid for by the client. That was common knowledge.
Airbus turns a new page in its history. The day of the engineers was over. Enter the captains of industry, eyes fixed on the markets to capture and challenges to be met. A 46-year-old graduate of the National School of Administration, Bernard Latière, takes over the controls. He is a fierce negotiator who, according to his reputation, could sell sand to the Arabs. As soon as he arrives, the new boss has to save a contract.
6h30, le téléphone sonne, et une voix à l'accent de gendarme alors, mais vraiment un gendarme, me dit ici le service du chiffre du ministère des Affaires étrangères. L'ambassadeur à Delhi, il a télexé pour dire que l'affaire était foutue si vous n'y allez pas tout de suite, parce que les Américains sont revenus et le Kid avait mis, je crois, $6 millions sur la table pour enlever le coup. Bon, j'ai aussi fait venir Béteille à Paris et 36 heures après, on était là-bas. Alors j'ai eu 2 coups de chance. Le premier, c'était de pouvoir dire au maréchal Lal, écoutez, je vous remercie d'être dur comme ça avec nous, parce que vous me permettez d'être dans mon pays natal le jour de mon anniversaire. C'était vrai. C'était vrai. Et on va déjeuner dans un hôtel d'État. Et alors le hasard a voulu que la table à côté, il y avait les 15 mecs de Boeing, et la table à gauche, il y avait les 18 mecs de Lockheed. Et lorsqu'à la fin du déjeuner, ils ont vu arriver un gâteau d'anniversaire et le staff d'Indian Airlines se lever en chantant « Happy birthday to you, Bernard », ils ont dit « ça sent le roussi ».
But Airbus still hadn't solved its main problem, how to beat Boeing on its home turf.
We had to conquer the world, which meant conquering the USA.
Il fallait surclasser, comme on dit en passant de la classe éco à la première, il fallait surclasser Boeing. C'est-à-dire que si Boeing envoyait pour la dernière visite son directeur commercial, c'est ce qu'il faisait normalement, c'était d'ailleurs son boulot, Airbus Industrial a envoyé le président.
To get a foot in the door of America, Airbus takes a huge gamble. The former astronaut, Frank Borman, then CEO of Eastern Airlines, had to renew his aging fleet of planes. Bernard Latière made him an offer he couldn't turn down.
Ça devait me venir du fait que mon père était concessionnaire d'automobile. Vous savez, on vous prête la Rolls pour le week-end et puis vous l'achetez le lundi, quoi. J'ai failli être foutu à la porte par le conseil de surveillance. D'ailleurs, on leur a prêté 4 avions pour 6 mois gratuitement. Ce qui était prendre un risque énorme parce qu'on leur prêtait des avions neufs. Et quand ils ont volé, ça ne vaut pas le même prix. Hein. Ça tournait autour de 150 à 200 millions de dollars, le risque qu'on prenait. Mais je savais que lui, de son côté, il en prenait un parce qu'il fallait qu'il forme une centaine d'équipages.
This is one of the most unusual sights you'll ever see. The colors of an American airline on an airplane not built in America.
And so war broke out between Airbus and Boeing. In the USA, the reprisals came swiftly. A fierce smear campaign was unleashed against Airbus. The American authorities stepped into the fray.
They grounded the planes because the stewardesses had pimples. They got pimples in the Airbus, spots on their face.
And where were they coming from? And why was it happening? And was there something in the airplane that was causing it?
I went over with an Air France doctor, and right away he discovered what was going on. The life jackets that Eastern had provided had this red paint on them. When the flight attendants would put them on for the demonstration, they would get pimples.
We understood what was going on. You now solved a problem, but it wasn't an A300 problem, but the A300 is where it happened.
The conflict was brought before the American Congress in Washington, which leveled serious charges against Airbus. A new dimension, politics, had made its appearance in the confrontation between the two constructors.
I was only complaining about the sale transaction in which one of our airline companies had the privilege of using 4 Airbus aircraft without cost for a period of 6 months. This was, in fact, a subsidy to the airline that was unfair to the competition.
Despite the pressure from Congress, Frank Borman is resolute and buys 32 Airbus 300s.
We're happy with the engines, the components, and all the systems. We're looking forward to buying more Airbus A300s because we're convinced that this will be the plane most in demand until the turn of the century.
The airplanes were incredibly cheap. And an airline like Eastern Airlines, which is on the verge of bankruptcy, getting very, very cheap aircraft. Of course, Airbus lost money on selling aircraft to Eastern Airlines. There was a money-losing transaction.
Et c'était surtout la première référence américaine. Et les Japonais qui ne nous parlaient même pas, parce qu'ils ne recevaient pas, ont commencé à ouvrir la porte. Et on a eu deux contrats qui ont suivi au Japon, les gens nous disant tranquillement, si vous n'avez pas eu de référence américaine.
Now it's Boeing's turn to wring their hands. In the Seattle offices, the American engineers are laying out a new project, an Airbus killer. September 26, 1981, the B767 rears its head. It has an uncanny resemblance to the Airbus A300. The balance of power has shifted. From this point on, the two constructors are eyeing each other, copying each other.
You always have to be pushing. And you can never take anyone lightly. Now, can a corporation become arrogant? Absolutely. One of my jobs as I became president and then chief executive officer was to shake Boeing a bit and say, you can't stand still. You have to move forward.
Airbus goes shot for shot with Boeing. They counter the 767 with a new aircraft, the A310. This competition starts to look like a boxing match, each side striving for the advantage.
Comme nous allons continuer de vendre, comme de surcroît nous avons lancé un nouveau modèle de 310 dont nous avons déjà placé une soixantaine d'avions et en Europe et auprès d'une grande compagnie américaine, Eastern, qui a des options, cela veut dire que pour la première fois, je crois, dans l'histoire européenne depuis l'âge du jet, on va atteindre une entreprise de dimension de taille américaine et pas de la taille artisanale qui était jusqu'à présent la taille européenne.
Fantasy or premonition? At the Paris Air Show, the management is flying on a burst of confidence.
Bien, en ce qui concerne le concurrent américain, le 767, il est très clair que nous avons réussi à vendre l'Airbus 310 contre le 767 dans des compagnies qui ne sauraient en aucun cas être suspectées de préférences européennes. Donc, eh bien, dans les 10 ou 15 années à venir, il y aura bagarre.
The battle becomes all-out war on February 14, 1987. On that day, all eyes are on Toulouse. For the first time, Airbus steals the show from Boeing. 2,000 guests, heads of government, but also 36 client companies attend a spectacular ceremony. Like a rock star, the new mid-range aircraft, the A320, makes its entrance on stage. Jean Pierson, Airbus's new CEO, has the privilege of escorting Lady Di, godmother of the aircraft, in an extravaganza that would turn Boeing green with envy. Meanwhile, Washington opens fire. The White House threatens Europe with financial sanctions if the French and German governments continue to subsidize Airbus.
Airbus est un succès et poursuivra. Et il n'y a pas de bataille, il y a une agression, ou une éventuelle agression américaine, totalement infondée, sur des arguments de parfaite mauvaise foi, et qui ne sont pas de nature à influencer le moins du monde, les Européens en général, les Français en particulier, car ils n'ont à cet égard aucun complexe. Les avances remboursables que nous donnons à notre industrie sont peu de choses, à côté des aides considérables, publiques, qu'au titre des programmes militaires, les Américains donnent à leur industrie aéronautique civile.
At the heart of this conflict, two visions of the market economy confront one another. But both sides have the same objective, to help an independent national industry, aeronautical construction.
I think one of the key differences is when we launch a new commercial airplane, it's a Boeing investment. We pay for it in its entirety.
From the U.S. perspective, the launch aid that Airbus was receiving, in effect, took a lot of the risk out of the business. So rather than having to borrow the money commercially or finance it out of cash, as the American aerospace makers by and large did, Airbus had the money up front from the government and was repayable only to the extent that its sales were successful. So from the U.S. perspective, that was really a kind of risk-free model.
New measures announced by the president.
Ronald Reagan, his hands full with his combat against the USSR, doesn't go very far in carrying out his threats. The American president can't afford to make an enemy of Europe.
With Star Wars research.
Boeing was enormously successful in that period. Boeing benefited immensely from the Reagan military buildup. So I think while Boeing and the U.S. government wanted to fire a warning shot across the bow.
After this warning shot, negotiations begin. In 1992, Europeans and Americans managed to come to an agreement over the financing of their industries.
And what the Civil Aircraft Agreement did for the first time, and this was extremely important for Europe, it legitimized their form of financial aid to Airbus. What that agreement said is that no more than 6% of the development costs of new aircraft for Boeing could come through these indirect subsidies, through Defense Department or NASA or other contracts that had spin-off benefits. So it created this framework which has existed since that time.
However, it was a short-lived truce. Less than 1 year after the 1992 agreement, the newly elected president, Bill Clinton, made a visit to Boeing. In an uncommonly biting speech, he denounced the repayable advances accorded to Airbus.
Other nations followed targeted strategies of partnerships to pierce markets which you had dominated under a free market system, but with which you could not compete if Europe subsidized Airbus to the tune of $26 billion, for example. And we can't begin by giving up on the production of aircraft, which is what we have come dangerously close to doing by sitting by and letting our competitors do things that we did not do to meet the competition.
Bill Clinton simply threw into question the agreement between the U.S. and Europe. On top of that, he sued Airbus for unfair competition. And it's the World Trade Organization that would resolve the dispute. It was, in fact, a gambit.
Boeing had just announced a major layoff of employees, which I think largely had to do with the recession and cyclical downturns in the airline industry. But Clinton used that as an opportunity to go after the Europeans and go after Airbus, and to say that some of Boeing's difficulties were directly a result of subsidized competition from Europe.
Then it's the same old, same old. Both sides trot out the same worn-out arguments.
Les subventions américaines sont incontestables. Nous avons estimé, nous ne sommes pas sûrs d'être arrivés, je dirais, au bout du calcul, sans prendre en compte ce que j'appellerais les bénéfices d'un fantastique marché militaire intérieur. Nous arrivons, ces 10 dernières années, à 23 milliards de dollars.
That combination of commercial and military capability has always been part of Boeing all the way from the start. In fact, the first contract that Bill Boeing had was to build trainer aircraft for the U.S. Navy. So throughout our history, that combination of commercial and military business has been important because they tend to be offsetting business cycles. And as we came out of World War II, for example, as being part of that arsenal of democracy, we built this great industrial capacity. There were new technologies, new jets that came out of that, like the B-47 and B-52 bombers, new technology like swept wing technology, jet technology. That was some of the foundation that ultimately led to the next generation of commercial aircraft.
It should not distract from the fact that, government involvement in the aerospace industry is, whether you like it or not, quite normal in the entire world. You will find that in Russia, you will find that in China, in Europe, as well in the United States. It's just different systems of government support. So my conclusion is we could spend our money better than throwing it at hundreds of legal experts, legal firms on both sides of the Atlantic. But gee, I mean, I'm prepared to continue for a few more rounds.
While the haggling goes on, so does business. A growing number of companies succumb to the charms of the A320. For the first time, the European constructor wins out, not thanks to the rebates it can offer, but thanks to its technological advances.
The significant innovation introduced by Airbus in the A320 suddenly made any plane not equipped with that system seem all hat. This cutting-edge fly-by-wire system ensures that the plane would always hold to its flight parameters, no matter what the pilots did.
The success of the A320 opens up new prospects for Airbus, the hope of one day outperforming Boeing. 2 decades after its founding, the European constructor had become a major player.
There's no question that the A320 was the start of Airbus's big rise because of the sheer volume. This is a business that's all about volume, and if you can build dozens or scores of something, that's good, and if you can build hundreds of something, that gives you an awful lot of pricing power. And you look back in the days of the A300, it was one a month. Pricing power is terrible, your industrial power is negligible. All of a sudden, when you start ramping up to hundreds per year, as they did by the end of the 90s with the A320, you have a lot more industrial power and a lot more pricing power. You're more competitive.
Even so, Boeing still has a good dose of arrogance. Answering tit for tat, they celebrate the construction of the 1000th 747. The message is clear. You're nowhere near doing better than us.
In our business, it's a very unique long cycle business. Typically, the time from a technology decision or launching a new airplane to the airplane being in the marketplace can be measured in 5, 10 years, perhaps more than a decade. And typically, once those products are introduced, they'll be in the hands of customers for decades to follow. So we have a very long cycle business, which means each decision we make is very important because it's a very capital intensive business. It's high investment up front to create that future product. So we have to get it right. And you have to make the right bets, the right technology investment to reap decades of benefit.
Constructing profitable planes is an obsession for Boeing, as it is for Airbus. The European constructor takes a gamble on the long-haul market. With the A340, they hope to grab the brass ring, but Boeing is one step ahead. They're working on a revolutionary 350-seat aircraft, a custom-made plane totally designed digitally with the collaboration of 8 airline companies.
The opportunity I had was to create a brand new airplane that could be better than an A330 or an A340. And we had a clean sheet of paper and an opportunity to create an exciting airplane. That's what we set out to do. It wasn't about building an MD-11 killer or an Airbus killer. It was about, we can build an airplane that fits the customer's needs better and therefore is a more exciting product. We can do that.
It was not until 1992 that Boeing decided to go into what I would call real competition. That's to say, launching good planes. And they came out with the 777, which is a fantastic plane, a wonderful program. That's real competition because you're responding to one plane with another plane.
An oversized gas guzzler, the 4-engine long-haul A340 was Airbus's first strategic error. The clients, even the most loyal, rejected it outright.
Concerning Air France, we quickly came to the conclusion that, in view of our network, the best plane for us in the future was the 777-300ER, and not the 340-600. And once we had reached that decision, carefully considered through a series of meetings and endless studies, the choice became evident for me. Then, I wanted to meet the major stockholder, common to both Airbus and Air France, that is, the French government. I requested a meeting with the Prime Minister, Lionel Jospin, to explain my choice to him and what I was preparing to announce.
I think I can guess what Lionel Jospin told him, of course. I regret your decision, but if you think it's in the best interests of the company, go ahead.
With hindsight, it was the right decision. Because now we're in 2015, and we see that the A340-600 is no longer manufactured and no longer sold.
At present, Air France KLM has the world's second largest fleet of 777s. Air France alone has the third largest fleet of 777s. And do you know what they call the 777 over at Air France?
Airbus managed to bounce back in Asia. The globalization of the markets has at least one positive aspect. It offers several hunting grounds where Airbus could hope to plant their flags.
The number of planes depends on the growth of air traffic. You have no influence over the number of planes ordered. It's a function of the growth of the market. And it's easy to see that the European markets were on a downturn. The Asian zone was picking up. But what counts is if you can get your product known in all the countries concerned. Then all those countries will order the plane from you.
By the end of the 1990s, Airbus had managed to extend its reach to 5 continents. It was active in China, Singapore, Vietnam, India, Brazil, Australia, the US, the Middle East, as well as in Europe. Only Great Britain was holding out. But you don't sell a $100 million airplane as you would a bar of soap. The negotiations are long and tricky. In 1996, the CEO of US Airways, Steve Wolf, a loyal customer of Airbus, wanted to renew his fleet. To close the deal, Jean Pierson went so far as to put his body on the line.
They asked me to go to Washington to meet with Steve Wolf. They told me everything had been agreed on. We just had to do a bit of a show, shake hands, and it was a done deal. So, in the morning meeting in Steve Wolf's office, there's just the 2 of us. And Steve pulls out a list of 25 points. Well, that was a surprise. You don't want to know what I said to my guys when I got out, but anyway. So, we have these 25 points. I look over them and quickly answer. Okay, we'll agree to all these points. We'll do some negotiating over these points, nothing too serious. And then we came to the rebates. Well, now at that time, I was following a weight loss program. I stood up, and I was wearing a suit too big for my new weight. I undid the belt, and my trousers dropped. And I said, there, I've nothing more to give. End of the negotiations. He burst out laughing, called in his secretary. I barely had time to get decent. So we drank some champagne, and the deal was done.
And it turned out to be a very profitable striptease indeed. 400 planes, the largest order in the history of civil aviation. Airbus began to see itself in a starring role, and why not even surpass Boeing someday? In the US, the backlash was not long in coming. In 1997, Boeing bares its financial teeth. They plopped down $13 billion on the table to buy their main competitor, McDonnell Douglas, a major player in the military market. Phil Condit manages the operation.
The combination of these 2 great companies are going to operate in the global marketplace as the Boeing Company and will be the world's leading aerospace company. The reason for the merger with McDonnell Douglas was to produce a company that had more financial strength. It was not about competition or winning a competition. It was how to make the company more resilient, stronger over the long term.
The European Commission steps in, convinced that it was a maneuver to undermine Airbus.
La flotte aérienne dans les mains dépendants de Boeing va passer de 60 à 80% et que c'est manifestement une tentative d'étouffement d'Airbus.
So we decided to drag their butts up to Brussels.
Not surprisingly, Europe threatens to veto the Boeing-McDonnell Douglas merger. Once again, politics joins the fray.
I'm concerned about what appear to be the reasons for the objection to the Boeing-McDonnell Douglas merger. by the European Union. And I think that it would be unfortunate if we had a trade standoff with them. But we have a system for managing this through the World Trade Organization, and we have some options ourselves when actions are taken by Europe in this regard.
Brussels demands a major concession from Boeing to renounce the juicy exclusive contracts it had with certain American airlines.
Boeing, en dernière minute, a proposé ou accepté le remède qu'on cherchait en vain depuis des semaines, c'est-à-dire sur le point des contrats de longue durée et d'exclusivité. Et donc je peux constater avec satisfaction que sur ce point-là, la Commission a eu gain de cause.
Airbus and Boeing are the only ones left standing, but the American aircraft manufacturer still has a marked advantage. Toward the end of the 20th century, Boeing's net worth was $58 billion, whereas Airbus announced a turnover of more than $24 billion. And a paradox of history, Airbus announced that for the first time they sold more civil aircraft than Boeing. Europe struck back at the USA. To make its weight felt, Europe demanded that its civil and military aeronautical industries join forces.
S'il n'y a que 3 sociétés dans le monde qui fabriquent des hélicoptères, s'il n'y a que 3 sociétés dans le monde qui fabriquent des lanceurs spatiaux, des satellites et autres, nous serons de cela.
The EADS company groups the aeronautical activities of Airbus, of Matra, the missile manufacturer Ariane Rockets, and the German company DASA, constructor of the European fighter plane, the Eurofighter. Proof of the importance of this agreement, it is the French and German heads of state in person who sign it into being. This new consortium does a turnover of $20 billion, half that of Boeing. For its christening, EADS treats itself to a pretty present, the launching of the largest plane ever imagined, codename A3XX, now known as the A380. Capacity up to 800 passengers. The necessary investment was on par with the enormous size of the project, 11 billion euros. The idea was to smash the monopoly of the B747. Meanwhile, the American constructor was betting on the Dreamliner, its new 200, 300-seat plane made entirely of composite materials, therefore lighter and more fuel efficient.
We carried out an extensive study based on experience and the progression of our sales, and it shows that the very large aircraft, the 747-8 and the A380, have a market limited to 540 planes over the next 20 years. 540 planes out of the 38,000 that will be sold. So it's a rather insignificant market.
In 20 years, there will be over 100 megacities, and they will be needing bigger planes. China, for example. Its international air traffic is going to skyrocket, and you'll see that the A380 will be playing a major role.
The saga between Airbus and Boeing comes down to a difference in their DNA. The European company is a gambler who likes to take risks. The American is a prudent investor with an eye to its stockholders.
If we said we are going to have a football game between Europe and the United States, one side would appear with short pants and a round ball and a net and say you can only hit with your feet. And the other side would appear with helmets and shoulder pads and a funny shaped ball and said I can throw it and catch it. And they would both think they're right.
In the early 2000s, the battlefront shifts. The arrival on the market of low-cost airlines and the Gulf companies eagerly buying up planes by the hundreds marks a turning point in the history of aviation. The reign of the engineers, then that of the captains of industry, now give way to the age of the almighty customer.
You can build as many aeroplanes as you want, but then you need customers like me to be able to sell those aeroplanes so that you can produce more aeroplanes. And if you don't have customers, there is no point of you building aeroplanes. So the critical person in this whole chain is the customer.
If, in this brave new world, the customer is king, then the salesman is prince. They assume power. They're the ones who rack up the figures, like John Leahy, head honcho of Airbus sales. 200 days a year, he's out prospecting across the globe. Here he's in India to sell the future A380.
You know, there are about 1.1 billion people in India right now. 1.1 billion. And there are more middle-class people here in India than there are in Western Europe or in the United States.
His target? The 15 million travelers stuck in trains for 2 days when they could do the same trip by plane in 2 hours.
We are using
My business is transporting passengers. If you can make it more efficient with a lower cost, I think it would be more profitable than a smaller plane.
And you're charging the same rates as the train?
Yeah. Right now, at least 30% of the seats on every flight are at train fare and below.
Train fare and below. Well, we have the airplane, you have the market. So it's your call.
You get into the business and you get hooked. It grows on you. And every commercial campaign is a game where it's winner take all.
It's a fight to the finish, an existential struggle. And even more so as there's always the hope of waging the decisive battle.
And if ever there was a decisive battle, it's the one waged between Airbus and Boeing at the beginning of the 2000s for the military aviation market.
One of the reasons that Boeing did the merger with McDonnell Douglas and the Rockwell acquisition was that we had a very small military capability and a very big commercial activity. And we said it would be better to have balance between the two. That was before 9/11. As it turned out, that was a really good decision because commercial activity went very steeply down after 9/11. And the strength of the military business kept the company financially strong.
After 9/11, the U.S. Air Force had to renew its aging fleet of tanker planes. These aircraft refuel fighter planes in flight during their mission. Boeing, of course, had its hat in the ring, but Airbus crashed the party and jumped into the bidding.
In the tanker story, there was a competition between a Airbus tanker, which is based on a 330 fuselage. 330 being an excellent airplane. And Boeing, which offered the 767, which is already, when it was offered, was an obsolescent airplane.
It's a golden contract. 179 aircraft with a price tag of $35 billion. The saga would last nearly 10 years and involve several presidents on both sides of the Atlantic. In the first phase, Boeing unsurprisingly wins the bidding, but the decision is invalidated due to charges of corruption. A government buyer agreed to favor Boeing in exchange for a job with the American company. Airbus renews its offensive. To maximize their chances, they joined forces with the American equipment manufacturer Northrop Grumman and proposed to assemble the future tanker planes in the United States. The verdict would come down in February 2008.
Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to announce that the development and procurement of up to 179 new KC-45A tanker aircraft is awarded to Northrop Grumman Corporation.
Airbus is awarded a contract in the United States. The House of Representatives thinks otherwise.
And you can't take this pig and put a flag on it and say it's an American airplane. It's not an American airplane. There is no justification that I have heard yet for what happened, switching this thing in the middle, going away from the mid-sized tanker to a great big tanker that's going to be more expensive, and the risk of building this thing is huge.
The only way the U.S. Air Force can operate is to choose the best aircraft. And the best aircraft was the Airbus. So they chose the Airbus. But the U.S. Congress, the Congress who pays the Air Force, said, if you want the American taxpayers' money, you will not be able to buy the Airbus tanker. We won't allow you.
6 months later, the congressman in Washington managed to open a new tender to be held after the presidential election. Airbus hardly had time to savor its victory. The election of Barack Obama deals the players a new hand. Again, political considerations weigh into the picture.
I think we structured a competition that was fair, that was based on a variety of factors, including price, including warfighting capabilities, including life cycle costs, and Boeing was the clear winner of that process.
Airbus and Northrop Grumman were 100% from engines down to factory for the aircraft, Republican, Southern Republican. Boeing actually went 100% Democrat. Engines in a district, Connecticut, pure Democrat. Aircraft, of course, Seattle, pure Democrat. All of their backers, Democrats. In 2008, Democrats swept the government. And I think that was probably the biggest single factor that made the requirement shift over to a politically palatable jet.
Europe cries foul.
Ce sont des méthodes qui ne sont pas bonnes à l'endroit des alliés européens des États-Unis, et ce sont des méthodes qui ne sont pas bonnes pour les États-Unis, qui est une grande nation, leader, avec laquelle nous sommes proches et amis, qui lutte contre le protectionnisme, et s'ils veulent être entendus dans la lutte contre le protectionnisme, qui ne donne pas l'exemple du protectionnisme.
This contract was one based on value for money, as they say. And I think that what went on in the wings was that Congress, which controls the purse strings, figured that this deal would not sit well with the American public. The American Army was already using Sodexo, a worldwide French company, to equip their barracks. Congress probably thought that French tanker planes on top of that would be going too far.
It was Boeing against Airbus, and I've always said to my colleagues when they were complaining about Boeing fighting hard and tough that battle, pulling all political strings possible, say, what would we do if there was a huge tanker contract to be won in Europe? And Boeing had a strong product, and Boeing was trying to break into our market. Obviously, we would also do everything to win this battle.
So there was a tender. The tender was real. It was attractive. It was open. France is now in the process of acquiring tanker planes. But there was no open tender bidding on that contract.
In losing the tanker contract, Airbus realized it had to play the game differently in the United States. It needed more support here. It needed to be more thoroughly embedded in the United States. And I think the fact that it's ended up using the investment that it was supposed to make in Alabama to serve the tanker contract to now build A320s, I think that's a wonderful, ironic turnaround.
12 years after the beginning of the tanker plane saga, Airbus finally managed to become American. Now, Airbus, like Boeing, has traded its original nationality for a global identity. Their market is worldwide. It's normal that their factories follow the same path.
Tianjin and Mobile are part of this internationalization strategy. If you go back 10 years, we had none of this. I mean, it was 10 years that we decided for Tianjin, and it's been 3 years back that we decided to build a final assembly line in Mobile. But we've had engineering centers already in these countries. We had large procurement contracts already in these countries. We have done step after step to expand our international footprint and particularly our industrial footprint.
Likewise, Boeing has operations around the world. We have tens of thousands of suppliers, some in the United States, many in Europe, many around the world. So we both work in global industries.
We need to be realistic about this competition between Boeing and Airbus. It's a duopoly anyway.
Now these two aircraft manufacturers share the planet. They are present the world over, sometimes in the same places. They use the same suppliers, the same engine makers. They have the same customers. They dominate a global market in a globalized economy.
And what is the result of a duopoly? No real innovation. Airplanes look the same. Year passes, decades passes, they look the same. Always the tube and the wings. No flying wings, no flying bodies, no separable passenger capsule, no innovation differences at all.
Competition does improve products for everyone. I mean, the planes that are flying today are far, far better than they've ever been before, and we all benefit from that. But the question of who gets the biggest share is an extremely important one. And it's one that, at least in these leading edge industries, countries will fight over.
You know, this continual cutthroat competition between Boeing and Airbus is healthy for the market. But it is also healthy for the two groups. It's the best way to protect ourselves from new players entering the market, like the Chinese, the Canadians, the Brazilians, the Russians.
Airbus, Boeing. Their shared interest is simply colossal. To protect their golden goose worth $3 trillion, the value of plane orders over the next 30 years, yesterday's rivals have become the best of enemies.